Hey, what's going on, gang? This is Nate on the Stone. Welcome back to my channel, and welcome to the 33rd episode of the Rolling Stone, where I give my initial thoughts, impressions, and analysis about stories that are currently making their way through the news cycle. And yes, that is a very provocative title for the video. That's why I gave it that title, but that is going to be our last story. So sit tight, don't worry, we're going to get to that in due course. Our first story, because we've got to gently work our way into these things. Our first story is actually about President Barack Obama. Former President Barack Obama has made himself the center of attention again in the news. What happened was that last week, President Obama was giving a speech to the Democracy Alliance, which is a group of Democratic Party donors. They meet in Washington, D.C. And while he was speaking to this group of donors, President Obama actually made the case for moderation. Okay? He didn't name any names, but he was telling the Democratic Party in general, and the 2020 Democratic presidential candidates in particular, that they can't go too far to the left, okay? This is actually what he said, okay? President Barack Obama said this, quote, "Even as we push the envelope and we are bold in our vision, we also have to be rooted in reality. The average American doesn't think we have to completely tear down the system and remake it," unquote. He was basically saying that, yeah, it's great to be idealistic, great to be a visionary, but at the end of the day, that doesn't count for anything if a candidate can't get elected. And since people want a moderate candidate, you gotta be moderate. Now, of course, there was pushback to this. The Democrat Party and the ideological left, which just, let's see, what was it, 11 years ago, was welcoming Obama with open arms, crying him, saying that he was the second coming of God almost. They actually turned against him. Bernie Sanders said, "I am not trying to tear down the system." Julian Castro, who actually worked in the Obama administration, in the cabinet, said, well, of course I respect what Obama said, but at the end of the day, anyone would be preferable to Donald Trump. And Vox actually said that, well, gee, President Obama, for the last couple of months, he's been trying to actually make himself into a moderate. He's been charting a middle of the road sort of a path. Don't be too radical. This is kind of strange. And it is kind of strange when you think about it, because President Obama is not a moderate by any stretch of the imagination. So the real question is, why would a radical politician be charting a middle of the road path, especially when he knew that making that position known would come with this pushback, that this pushback was predictable? Well, there's actually a reason, because a lot of people actually on the right, they were using this as sort of a barometer as to how far left the left has actually gotten since Obama's time. They said, wow, if even Barack Obama now is saying, you can't go too far to the left, and they're actually pushing back against that, they must have gone, just totally over the left edge of the cliff. It's not quite like that, I'm afraid. And the answer to this question lies in one of the descriptions that I just gave about Obama, that he is a politician, because he is. In this way, he is not a true believer, okay, in an ideology. He's not a true believer like AOC or Bernie Sanders. He is a politician, which means that he will do and say whatever is in his best interests at the time that he says or does, whatever he says or does, right? Whatever is going to advance his position, his personal position, his power, his influence, that is what he's going to do. Great example of this. In 2008, when he was running for president for the first time, he said that his Christian faith, okay, compelled him to say that his Christian faith convinced him of the truth that marriage was only between a man and a woman. Fast forward 4 years, he's running for re-election in 2012, and all of a sudden, you guys probably remember this, he had evolved on the issue. Now, of course, marriage included gay and lesbian pairs. What had changed in those 4 years? Certainly not the arguments for or against, redefining marriage. What changed in those 4 years was that Obama was able to see quite clearly which way the cultural winds were blowing. In 2008, it was still kind of on the knife's edge. In 2012, everyone who could look just a couple of steps into the future knew how that argument was going to go. And so he placed himself firmly on the side of the powers that were going to be. He placed himself on the winning side. Okay? Now, what he is doing here, he's doing the same thing here, okay, putting himself on the winning side. He is reacting to 2 different polls that came out recently. The first one, as reported by the New York Times, actually says that most Democrat voters, especially in battleground states, would prefer a moderate candidate. This is how the New York Times story put it, quote, "As the Democratic candidates intensify their arguments over how best to defeat President Trump, their core voters in Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Arizona, and Florida are counseling them to pursue a political middle ground," unquote. So what does that look like? Well, the story says this. 62% want a candidate that finds common ground with the GOP. 55% want the candidate to be more moderate than most other Democrats. 49% want a candidate that promises to restore Washington, D.C. to normal. So, most Democrat voters don't want someone radical like Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren or AOC. They want someone predictable, right? Only a small minority, like 35, 39%, actually wants someone who is ideologically committed to the progressive ideology, the progressive vision, and basically want to remold the country in that form. That's the first poll. Now, the second poll is even more interesting, okay? It was a USA Today Suffolk poll, and it found this. This is really interesting, gang. 57% of Democrat voters are still undecided as to who they're going to vote for in the primaries, okay? More than that, 18% said that they hoped that someone else would jump into this primary race. And 10% said specifically that the person that they wanted to jump into this primary race was Mrs. Barack Obama herself, Michelle Obama. Okay, so you take these 2 polls. Most Democrat voters want a moderate candidate. At least some part of the Democrat Party, of Democrat voters, want Michelle Obama to run for president. And there you have the answer. There is the reason why Barack Obama has all of a sudden started painting himself as a moderate. Okay? If Michelle Obama jumped into the race now, I think she would get a lot of support. Heck, she might even win the primary. She might become the Democrat Party's candidate for president. But the Obamas are smart. You gotta give them that. They're politically cunning, okay? A guy doesn't go from state senator to U.S. senator to president in just a couple of years like Barack Obama did. You can't do that without having brains and guts, okay? So say what you want about him. You can't say that he's an idiot. So he knows that if Michelle threw her hat into the race for 2020, the chances that she would actually defeat Trump, very, very minuscule, right? However, 2024 is a different issue. I would be willing to bet that Obama is betting that Trump is going to win re-election. Again, he's a smart guy. He's a smart politician. So 2024 happens, okay? Assuming Trump wins re-election, he's ineligible to run again. Obama's thinking, who is the GOP going to run in 2024? Right now, no one is really being touted as the heir to Trump, as an ideological heir or a successor to, his legacy or to this newly refurnished, kind of remolded, rebranded idea of conservatism. So 2024 is a blank slate, and Obama is betting that that's when Michelle is going to be able to jump into the race and just ride a wave back to Washington. It's going to be perfect. The Obamas came at the end of 8 years of George W. Bush, and then after the Obamas, and everyone loved the Obamas. Again, they were heralded as almost deities, as superhuman, as so smart, so dignified, so classy, so respected across the global theater, and to be followed by 8 years of Donald Trump, ugh. And then at the end of these 8 years of Donald Trump, here come the Obamas again, riding on their white chargers to the rescue, to restore hope and change, and yes, we can, to the American lexicon. This is what I would bet is going through Barack Obama's head. This is why he is painting himself as a moderate. He's not a moderate, okay? He can be just as flaming radical as the best of them if he thinks that that is going to advance his own agenda. And his own agenda happens to be power, okay? And right now, his agenda, his power, and Michelle's power, coincidentally, which is also his power, is advanced by playing moderate. That's what's happening there. That's story number one. Story number two, oh gosh. It's about something that we haven't really talked about on The Stone, even though this conversation has been going on now for years, unfortunately. Transgender bathrooms. Isn't that precious, like Top Dollar says in The Crow? Yes, transgender bathrooms made another step forward in the good old USA this past week at the Palatine High School in Northwest Illinois. The school administration voted to give trans students unrestricted access to the bathroom of their choosing. Okay, this is how. This is what the school board said, actually. Quote, students shall be treated and supported in a manner consistent with their gender identity, which shall include students having access to restrooms and locker rooms that correspond to their gender identity. Unquote. So basically, if you're a boy, but you identify as a girl, you're going to use the bathroom and shower, right, with all the girls who are actual girls, who are biological girls. Same thing with girls who say that they're boys. Now, this story really blew up because Jonathan Von Marin, great guy. I haven't personally met him, but I've been following his work for years, and it's grade A, solid stuff. He's an editor and writer. I believe he's an editor. I know he's a writer for LifeSite News, and he also hosts his own podcast called The Bulwark. He actually shared a video on Twitter that showed one of these female high school students, a girl by the name of Julia Burka, okay, reacting to this decision by the high school. And you can see that she is just, it is taking all of her control and effort just to keep from emotionally collapsing in front of the camera, but because she's saying, you know, my privacy is going to be invaded. I'm not going to feel safe. I'm not going to feel comfortable knowing that biological men are in the bathrooms with me, showering with me, that I'm going to be naked in front of these people. It is the raw fear that we all have of exposing our nakedness to complete strangers of the opposite sex. And she's saying, now I'm going to have to live through that. Okay? And like she said, I'm not against trans people. And in fact, I wish that the school had, you know, found something else, because the school had actually advanced a compromise in that sense of creating an entire new set of bathrooms and showers and locker rooms specifically just for trans students, saying you can have your own separate facilities all over here, guys. But that wasn't good enough. It's never good enough. That's the secret. That is the kicker. It's never good enough. Okay? Case in point. Okay? Nova Mata, who is one of these trans girl students who filed one of two lawsuits against the Palatine High School in 2017, he said that he was ecstatic over the school's decision. And he said this in addition, quote, it's definitely a first step forward in many more steps. It's a great policy. Unfortunately, it's not everything we want, unquote. And there you have it. Even this isn't good enough. This is just the first step in many more steps. And I mean, once you've surrendered that first bit of ground, it just becomes easier and easier and easier to surrender all the other pieces of ground until tolerance, quote unquote, actually becomes domination. So what's going on here? Okay? What's happening with this? Well, first and most importantly, this is the abject will to power forcing society to live a lie, regardless of their beliefs, regardless of their philosophy, regardless of their religion, if they have one. Okay? It's the forcing of girls to lie and basically say that there is absolutely nothing special about being a girl. There is nothing of intrinsic worth about being a girl, because being a girl, being a woman, right, is just something all up here in your head. It's not essential. It's just how you feel or how you identify, right? There's nothing special about them because anyone can be a woman, right? Because if you look at pictures, if you watch the video that Jonathan Von Marin put up on Twitter, you actually see Nova Mata talking, and he looks like a boy. He sounds like a boy. He talks like a boy. The only thing, okay, that is feminine about him is that he grew his hair long and he dyed it pink. That's the only thing. Well, if that is now the only prerequisite that's needed for someone to say, yep, I'm a girl, then the word woman, the word girl, and the ideas behind those things are absolutely meaningless. Because if that's the only thing that it takes to be a woman, then anything can be a woman. And when anyone can be a woman, no one is a woman, right? I mean, The Incredibles, taught us that, right? When everyone's super, no one is going to be super. It's the same thing here. And I really just have to take just a small detour and point this out. An NBC legal analyst this past week, talking about the impeachment proceedings that are going on Capitol Hill, said that former UN Ambassador John Bolton needs to, quote unquote, woman up and testify to the the impeachment hearing. He needs to testify in the impeachment hearings. And it's just ridiculous, because when you say woman up, you're saying that the epitome of the idea of strength and boldness is woman. Okay, whether you're a woman or not, that's just the definition of strength and boldness. But at the same time, the word woman, again, like I was just saying, it has become so vacuous and so meaningless that anyone can use it for, that anyone can take it for themselves, which also then leads to this really weird idea, if anyone can be a woman, does that mean when we say woman up, our ideal and our standard of woman is actually not really a biological woman, but actually just a trans woman who just happens to be a biological male, which means that our standard of strength and boldness is actually still a man, in which case, does that still make it sexist? That's just a little food for thought, and try to say that 3 times fast. What this also does, okay, so besides the fact of forcing everyone, and especially women and girls, to acquiesce to a lie, it makes society, it makes us, okay, just a flock of sheep. Because in accepting the lie, the more willing that we are to swallow this lie, the more willing and accepting we're going to be of accepting any lie that is shoved to us, all for the sake, of keeping the peace, or all for the sake of tolerance, or all for the sake of safety, quote unquote. That's the new catchphrase today, safety, right? But the more willing that we are to accept these lies, the more willing that we're going to be to accept the lies in the future. And like I just said, there was that quote from Nova Matta, more lies, more demands are going to come, which means we're just going to have to keep acquiescing until society is completely remade in the ideological image, in which case we won't be living in the real world. We will, but it'll be a world that has been reshaped by the ideologues. Now, what's bad about this too is that there is really no political way to fight this. So Joy Pullman over at The Federalist, she wrote a great piece about this. And in her piece, she says this, quote, "Even if her school board had the will to protect young women like Julia Burka, these policies are subject to unelected judges and federal bureaucrats. Therefore, even if parents did change their school board, which is difficult enough, and so far has required fighting outside money and the entire media political establishment, they are likely not to be able to get it to rescind this policy," unquote. In other words, there is no real political solution to this. Now, to be fair, Pullman does list some political measures that can be taken to defend ourselves and our families and our children, especially our girls and daughters, from this, but they're more like holding actions. The only way that this can really be fought is by taking back the culture. And this goes back, again, to topics that we've talked about in the past couple of weeks. Can, for example, the right, if you will, the conservative movement, if you will, can it actually win the culture when it seems very content with succeeding ground, giving up ground to the ideologues, right? When it's much more willing to fight the ideologues' battle, to fight the ideologues on their own turf, using their definitions, sort of their way of thinking. Can we do that? Right? Are we actually willing, to think outside of the box, try to argue imaginatively, to give a vision of society, instead of going through the old, tired, worn out cliches of arguments that the right is very content at doing? To give you an example, I saw a tweet just this past week, again, from Candace Owens, and she was talking about some argument that Taylor Swift is having with some of the producers, I think, of her songs, and Candace Owens was like, well, gee, if Taylor Swift is this upset, just wait till she finds out what's going to happen when she finds out that the Democrats don't want her to spend her own money. And it was so frustrating, because it's the same, people will ultimately think with their wallets argument that we've heard from so many commentators from so many parts of the right for so long, and they're always proven wrong. Taylor Swift, whatever she was in the past, is now a committed ideologue. You just read her interview that she did this past summer with Rolling Stone. Not this Rolling Stone, but, you know, the actual Rolling Stone magazine. I wish we had their numbers, but we're not quite there yet. But you read that interview and you find out that she is a dyed-in-the-wool ideologue now. Ideologues don't listen to their wallets. Ideologues listen to their ideology. This is why Hollywood is content to keep making films like Charlie's Angels that flop, but that provide a narrative for the ideology, okay? Is the right going to be willing then to stop thinking like this, to actually think outside of the box, to retake the culture? I don't know. Which actually then leads me to this final point, which is also the most terrifying point. I've said before, and I'll repeat it here, that every action has an equal and opposite reaction. That's just the third law of thermodynamics. But it's not just true in physics. It's true in life in general. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction, which means that every lie inadvertently, inevitably, naturally creates a reaction against it. And the bigger the lie, the bigger the reaction is going to be. So a lie this big, okay, as illustrated with this transgender bathroom here in Northwest Illinois, the bigger the lie, which gets down really to one of the cores of who we are, not just personally, you know, male and female, but metaphysically male or female. A lie that gets down to that. The reaction to that lie is going to make the French Reign of Terror look like something that happened in a high school knife fight, okay? And not belittling high school knife fights. They can get pretty bloody and pretty bad. What I'm saying is that the reaction to this lie is going to be so unprecedented, it very well could, create fractures. I mean, it will be seismic. It'll be seismic, the reaction to this lie when it comes. And it will come. It's inevitable. It can't be stopped. Because every action has an equal and opposite reaction. I just don't know what the collateral damage is going to be from that reaction. But that is story number 2. Story number 3. And this is the one that you all have been waiting for, because this is how I titled this video. It is true. China has declared a Cold War on the United States. And apparently, so far, the Chinese are the only ones who know that they're even fighting this war, okay? The U.S., us, good old USA, Uncle Sam, asleep behind the wheel, doesn't even know what's going on. A bipartisan Senate report, okay, bipartisan Republicans and Democrats, found that our government has been overrun, for lack of a better word, Chinese spies, okay? This story came from the Daily Caller, and I'm going to be quoting extensively from it just to give you guys an idea of what's been going on. Okay? The Daily Caller said this, quote, "Foreign-born researchers working at U.S. agencies secretly joined China's payroll, sending sensitive U.S.-funded research to the country, while U.S. government agencies took almost no defensive measures against a major recruitment operation," a Senate investigation found. Researchers linked to the Chinese government formed a Chinese cell within the Department of Energy, attained access to American genomic data, and recruited other U.S. researchers to join, the bipartisan report stated. unquote. And this was done by the 1,000 Talent Program. That is the Chinese program to which these people had been recruited and to which, from which they were working. The 1,000 Talent Program, it buys off researchers doing work abroad and gets them to share secrets with the Chinese government, right? So we have all these foreign-born researchers. They are pretty much hired, recruited by the 1,000 Talent Program, and then they find secrets in the country or the government that they're working in and send them back to China. So here are some details. At the Department of Energy, the Daily Caller says this: the Department of Energy's Office of Intelligence and Counterintelligence found a postdoctoral fellow had removed 30,000 files and went to China. He applied to the 1,000 Talent Program while he was working at the Energy Department, and U.S. colleagues wrote him letters of recommendation for the Chinese program, the report stated. He allegedly told China his research area in the United States would play a critical role in advanced defense applications, and promised to keep in touch with specific national labs research teams after returning to China. Okay? And it's not just the Department of Energy. So we go now to the National Institute of Health. Quote, the National Institute of Health permitted access to genomic data to companies linked to the Chinese government without considering national security risks, such as weaponizing for biological warfare, the investigation found, nor did it consider whether the principal investigator is in a foreign country that is on a United States government watch list, unquote. And plus the report found out like some of the data that has been stolen from the US happen to be, for example, the specs for the engines of military jets. You know, something that it could actually be used against the Chinese, except, oh bother, now it can't be because now they have the specs and now they know all the weaknesses. You know what? This is the equivalent of the Galactic Empire having the rebels, hiring the Rebel Alliance to build the Death Star for them, okay? That's the equivalent here to this. And it gets even better. Are you ready for this, gang? Still from the Daily Caller's story, quote, the Department of Energy's Office of Intelligence and Counterintelligence had trouble investigating because of the language barrier and insular nature of the group of Chinese nationals working on 6 sensitive projects paid for by the U.S. government. In other words, the Department of Energy said, we couldn't do a darn thing because they all speak Chinese and no one here speaks Chinese, and plus they all hang out together because, Chinese of a feather flock together or some such thing. That's their excuse for why sensitive material was stolen right from under their noses. That's their excuse. We continue. From the National Institute of Health, quote, the National Institute of Health, which gives out over $31 billion in research grants a year, does not require potential researchers to be run against any law enforcement database. Rather, its vetting consists of reviewing the first page of results from a Google search, the report stated, unquote. Criminally. It's one of these situations where I really don't know whether I should laugh or cry, do both, or just, take turns with them. Oh boy, gang. So, here's a couple of thoughts. Okay, kind of going from least important to most important, roughly. In the first place, if you've been paying attention, and I know that you probably have, to the presidential election, you've probably heard, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, all of these candidates make some sort of promise about what they are going to get the government to do for us. Whether it's Medicaid for all, whether it's a universal preschool or universal higher education, canceling student debt, all of these grandiose plans. This is the government, okay, that is going to be running these things, okay? The government that can't even protect its own secrets. The government that doesn't even run background checks on these foreign-born nationals who apply to do research in our national labs and who then work on sensitive research projects. This is the government that doesn't vet its people. This is the government, that says, well, because they're speaking a foreign language and they're always hanging out together, guess there's nothing that we can do now, Jethro. That's the government that's going to be running your Medicaid for all. That's the government that's going to be running your universal preschool. That's the government that's going to be, paying off your student debt. Okay, this really does not give me any confidence to give the government any more power than it already has. Secondly, and more importantly, this is a prime example of when I say that we are an unserious country because we have an unserious government. One of the legitimate duties of the federal government is provide for the common defense. It says so right in the preamble of the Constitution. And one of the main things that means is keeping us safe from foreign enemies. Okay? The Chinese is one of, if not the, primary enemy that we have today. Anyone who says differently, or anyone who tries to say that Putin and Russia is the number one enemy, is a fool. And I will say that right here, right now, in this video. And I say that as a guy who does not like Putin, who does not trust Putin, but he is peanuts compared to Beijing and the Chinese Communist Politburo. Okay? So when our government welcomes these people without any background checks, with open arms, and just lets them work on our most sensitive projects, our most sensitive data, and just allows them, basically to steal all this data, all these plans, all of this, right from under our noses. We are not a serious country. We do not take our safety seriously. We do not take our national sovereignty seriously. They don't take our personal safety seriously. You heard about that, right? That genomic data that was stolen could have been weaponized for biological warfare. Who is that going to be targeted against? It's going to be us, the common people, right? That's who the Chinese, when it comes to blows, when that happens. And that is the third and the final point to wrap this all up. Because we are now in a Cold War. We like to think that we defeated communism and the West rose triumphant in 1989 after the Berlin Wall fell down and the USSR dissolved, right? We just celebrated the 30th anniversary of the wall coming down and the dissolution of the USSR, pretty much. That didn't happen because communism is still alive, most prominently and most dangerously in China. Now, the Chinese are very patient, and they have been working now for years to advance and expand and entrench their power economically and militarily, okay? They're hoping that they can basically take over the world without firing a shot. But if it does come to blows, they make all of our junk. And now they know what we're doing, but we don't know exactly what they're doing. Right? The Chinese know that they're in a war with us. These bureaucrats and politicians in DC, they may talk big, they may thump their chest, and they may say, well, you must re-elect us in order so that we can do this and that against the Chinese. They don't mean it. They don't buy it. And even if there are a couple of politicians who are honest about it, They can't do anything because all of their colleagues have their heads so far down in the sand or up in the clouds, worrying about their own ideologies and transgender bathrooms and all this, remaking our society into their image, that they are completely ignoring the Chinese. And when that happens, the Chinese not only will win, but they will deserve to win. And I'm saying that because stupid nations do not deserve to live, okay? If we want to be Darwinian about it and survival of the fittest, we don't even, match. We don't even have a chance. We're resting on our laurels. We've been resting on our laurels. And if that trajectory doesn't change, right now, as in a month ago, then not only will we be defeated, but we will deserve that defeat. But I think on that sour and sad, depressing note, I will wrap the video up here because I've been talking too long as usual. So, have a great weekend, gang. I will see you on Tuesday. Ciao.